The dark fantasy genre is quite possibly one of the most popular genres of all time, but it seems to constantly fade in and out of the public's consciousness. The genre seemingly has always been best portrayed through literature, with the occasional great dark fantasy film or television series coming out of the woodworks. The best example of a largely popular dark fantasy story in pop culture is that of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and even those films are based off the popular books written by J.R.R. Tolkien. Other stories you've probably heard of, but the film adaptations have all but sucked away the dark parts of the story, and those adaptations that do try to keep in any of the dark parts don't actually follow the books and just try being edgy. For example, Alice in Wonderland hasn't really had an adaptation that leans into the dark fantasy aspects of the story since the 1951 Disney version, and the Tim Burton films have really just been edgy or dark, quote-unquote. For those that don't know, the dark aspect of dark fantasy actually means that the story leans more into the disturbing, creepy, or even horror aspects of fantasy stories. The older versions of Alice in Wonderland portrayed Wonderland as this mystical but dangerous place that's full of vibrant colors but also deeply disturbing characters. Another possibly more prominent example of a story that straight up had all of its dark and disturbing aspects removed is, believe it or not, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, which since the 1939 film has only had one adaptation that's truly stuck to the source material, that being Disney's Return to Oz in 1985. I haven't actually read any of the original novels myself, but I will leave a link in the description to a video from In Praise of Shadows discussing the Return to Oz film, as well as the history of the novels and how they've slowly faded into the background of the Oz series despite being the, source material. He's a great content creator, and if you're interested in horror history and film retrospectives, you should go check out his channel. Throughout my early to middle school life, I slowly discovered my love for the dark fantasy genre. When I was in early middle school, I decided to read the Spiderwick Chronicles book series, and while the film adaptation may not stick super close to the books, I'm very glad to say that it is very much a good modern dark fantasy film rather than just being a dark and edgy one. The film does a fantastic job of translating most of the monsters from the books perfectly, and I'm always genuinely surprised with how good the goblins translate from book to film, both in their design and how actually scary they are, especially when they're in a swarm. While Spiderwick may have solidified my love for the dark fantasy genre, it was not my first experience with it. My first ever true delve into the genre to this day remains one of my favorite book series that I have ever read. I first read Jeff Smith's Bone when I was between the ages of 8 and 10. I was in 4th grade, and most of my friends, including myself, were mostly interested in book series like Diary of a Wimpy Kid and Captain Underpants, with some of my friends also being super into Goosebumps at the time. It was around then that a friend of mine told me about a graphic novel they were reading. They described it as a comic book that's the size of a regular book, and I immediately loved that idea because I didn't realize that graphic novels existed before then. He told me he was reading a series called Bone, and at the time I didn't really care about plot or characters. I just asked him if it was good, and he was very adamant that it was. I decided to start reading the series, but the school library constantly had multiple books in the series either missing or severely damaged, so our librarian told me if I was willing to wait a couple weeks, she'd soon have new and fresh copies of half the series coming in at the end of the month. I agreed to be patient, and she was kind enough to let me reserve the new copy she had of book 1 before it came in, so I was the first person to read it. Just for the sake of the rest of this story, I'll throw out that she ordered the rest of the books toward the end of the year, and that I read the final 4 to 5 books when I was in 5th grade. Our school's librarian was one of my favorite people at our school, and I love her to death, and I wish I'd gotten to tell her how important she was to help me grow my creativity throughout my entire school life, and that she meant the world to me. So if this somehow reaches you, thank you. I anxiously waited for my book to come in, and the first book in the series does an excellent job of setting up the main world we spend the first few books in, as well as introducing most of the characters we're going to be following through the rest of the series, while also cleverly alluding to some parts that'll come up later in the series and actually become quite important. Ghost circles. Phonebone is a great protagonist for us to follow, with his kind heart and cautious heroics. Smiley is goofy and lovable without him ever becoming annoying or too much. Phony is a greedy, narcissistic asshole who is somehow impossible to outright hate because of just how entertaining it is to see him utterly fail at almost everything that he ever does. Grandma Ben is a tough, level-headed countrywoman who lives in the old ways, but is also one of the most endearing, important, and shockingly funny characters in the entire series. Lucius is an old friend of Ben's who runs the local tavern of Barrelhaven, who, much like Ben herself, is shockingly super important to the overall story, and it's hilarious to see him and Phony constantly butt heads only for the Bone Cousin to get his ass handed to him every single time. And then there's Thorn, and Thorn is just I fucking love Thorn. Without delving too deep into any spoilers, Thorn is genuinely one of my favorite characters in any book series that I've ever read, female or not. Her backstory and constant subversions of tropes in the fantasy genre are just so well done, and her friendship with Phonebone is genuinely one of my favorite friendship dynamics of all time. And while Phonebone is obviously crushing on Thorn throughout the entire series, it's never used to create some awkward will-they-won't-they dynamic that becomes so much of an irritating focus that it takes away from the main story that they're actually trying to tell. And oh boy, boy, does this series have an amazing story that I won't delve into because I don't want to spoil too much, so let's get into the less spoilery parts of the dark fantasy parts of this dark fantasy series. And where better for us to start than quite possibly the most iconic part of this series aside from the Bone Cousins themselves. These are the rat creatures, the main monsters of this series, and I love these guys. They are so horrible and adorable. King Doc is awesome and terrifying and a genuine threat whenever he shows up. It's actually quite shocking that as the series goes on, Doc becomes more and more of a threat despite the fact that he slowly fades more into the background with like every new book. But Doc isn't even the big bad because he works for the mysterious hooded one, the creepy scythe-wielding green-cloaked head of the rat creatures, and that is literally all I can say about her without delving into spoilers, but she gets so much better as the series goes on. But she's not even the biggest big bad because the hooded one actually works for the even more mysterious Lord of the Locusts, who is, and I am not joking, a formless ancient entity that has existed since the dawn of time who's trying to regain access to the mortal plane so their reign of terror can continue anew and they can conquer the world. You heard me correctly. The biggest bad of the series is a Lovecraftian cosmic entity with no physical form. That is fucking amazing. And once again, without spoilers, other fantasy elements that this series has to truly put it under the dark fantasy genre are magical powers, ancient monks, dragons, fallen kingdoms, other planes of existence, limbo dimensions between planes of existence, ancient prophecies, warring tribes/species, talking animals, giant animals, superstitious townfolk, walking corpses, and that's literally only a brief summary of some of the stuff in the series. If you're looking to delve into a dark graphic novel series, Bone is something that I would highly recommend, even if I'm biased and already said it's one of my favorite series of all time. It was even confirmed back in 2019 that Netflix had bought the rights to adapt Bone into an animated series. They've already owned the rights to the series for over 2 years, and as of the time of me writing this, we don't actually know anything about the story aside from that they own it. So here's my advice to you, Netflix. Don't fuck this up.